So why do worm bins, when we add such a small amount of food to small worm bins, relatively speaking, get so wet so easily? Well, I thought I'd demonstrate why in this week 51 of our small worm bin weekly update. So this liquid has already drained out of the scraps I was saving for this little demo. And we have 1.53 pound of normal vegetable scraps that you would add to your small worm bin. I've deliberately left out things like melon and stuff like that. That's obviously massively high in water content. So you've got banana skin, tip of a cucumber there, tea bags well squeezed out, some salad leaf, tomato, just the normal things that you'd throw into your worm bin. So what we're going to do is we're going to freeze them for 24 hours. It's a beautiful sunny day to thaw these out, and I've got my little helper with me. And as they were thawing out, I was chopping them into much smaller pieces, except for the tea bags, because I don't want the contents to tip into the liquid. And you can see the effect that's had. So freezing and thawing on the banana skinners and then chopping it into little pieces has massively reduced the volume. The same with the salad bits. So it's a great method to use if you can use it in small worm bins, because the stuff breaks down so much quicker in the bin. So now we'll weigh. I've squeezed as much of the liquid out by hand as I can, and we'll just weigh the contents now and see what we're left with. And there's more liquid can come out of this. This is just what I could get as it defrosted by hand. It's still quite cold to the touch, so there's still a bit more to come from this, but it's enough for our purposes for this demonstration. You can see the liquid under the pot there. And now we'll just weigh this bag and see what we've got. And it's locked at 0.72, so we've lost 0.81, more than half of the contents in liquid, more than half in the weight of the contents, and that's the liquid there. Now I keep that, I put that into the watering cans when I'm watering the plants, and when I measured it, it was around the 300 mils mark. So you can imagine now, if you're putting that amount of scraps 3-4 times a week into your worm bin, which would be normal, there's actually at least a litre of liquid going into your bin every week. So it's something to keep in mind, and it's one of the reasons I really like the freeze-thaw method for managing the moisture content in small worm bins. Now here's our friends. This is the mother bin, and here's our friends, the little pot worms. And you'll notice, since I used up all of the free flour I was given, the population of the pot worms is dying right back, because the pH in the bedding is adjusting itself back to neutral. The flour, and the more aged the flour is, the more acidic it makes the bedding. So it's something to keep in mind if you do put a type of flour feed in. It doesn't bother the worms at all. It won't change the pH to the extent that the worms will bail out of the bin, but you will encourage a lot more pot worms in your bin. Now this bin again it's the least wet of the 3 bins we're going to look at today. If you remember back, we had very bad weather, lots and lots and lots of rain a couple of weeks ago, and these bins got drenched because the tarp didn't really do its job. Now most of the worms in the mother bin are now on the left hand side, and that's because I'm just feeding the left side in preparation for next week, when we'll harvest the worms and say goodbye to the mother bin and to this little series. So this is a very simple way to get your worms to migrate to one side of the bin or the other. And ideally what you would want to do is actually stop feeding the bin for a couple of weeks before you use this method, so that the worms have pretty much used up all the food that's anywhere in the vermicompost. And then they'll move very quickly over to where the fresh food has been added, because that's all there is in the bin. And then you can take a few different approaches from there. I mean, you can just harvest by hand, taking it out literally in fistfuls, the vermicompost that's there, and put fresh bedding on that side, or you can remove the worms and start a new bin with them. You've got all sorts of options from there, but it just saves a lot of time and effort in sifting the worms out of the vermicompost, which I don't tend to do. I prefer to let the worms do all the work. Now, just a quick comment, because somebody mentioned in one of the comments on a previous video about how do I harvest the cocoons. I don't. So if I remove the worms from, say, the mother bin, all I would do is simply add a piece of melon to the vermicompost that was left, because I'm not in a hurry to use it. So I would just add a piece of melon there, and then as the cocoons hatch, or those tiny little baby worms that are, you know, the thickness of a thread, which you wouldn't see, they'll make their way to the melon, and then every couple of days I take the melon out, scoop the worms off there. Once you've done that for 5-6 weeks and there's nothing appearing on the melon, you've got all the cocoons, they're all hatched. Any of them that's going to hatch, they're hatched, and you've got all the baby worms out, and then you can just use your vermicompost. So like I said, I like the worms to do all the work. So these are the 2 bins we're going to say goodbye to today. You can see they're so wet, but yet the worms seem quite happy in it. I mean, this is just mud. You can see the way it actually forms around the shape of my hand. You can just make mud balls with them. So I'm just going to empty this bin into the first bin there, and we'll put all of them into the big worm bin. There's still quite a bit of unfinished food in that second bin. So what that means is, within this amalgamated bin now, there's quite a bit of unfinished food for the worms. And what that means now is I'm not going to do like I did 2 weeks ago, which was put this vermicompost on a mesh, and then the worms will, because there's nothing in the vermicompost for them, they'll go hunting for food. So they'll just drop through the bottom of the mesh into the big worm bin, and then that leaves me the vermicompost to remove quite easily. Slightly different approach this week, because there's a lot of food unfinished still in that vermicompost, and the worms don't want to leave it. They're quite happy, even though it's very, very wet and muddy. I've just packed it all into the back of that worm bin, and what will happen is now I'm going to put food at the front of this, and as they're good and ready, they'll move into where the food is, but they'll carry on finishing the stuff that's in that vermicompost. Now, just by way of contrast, if you look at the vermicompost in the big bin, and you'll notice all of the food that was there 2 weeks ago is all gone. But this is lovely soft stuff, very friable. It just breaks up in your hand really easy. And compare that to how muddy the 2 small worm bins were, and that's just a case of drainage. Now, this is just a quick thing to show you, because I've seen comments in different forums about people worrying about leaving plastic on cardboard. It doesn't bother the worms at all. As the cardboard breaks down, the isopods and the worms will have it, and they'll just leave the plastic behind them. Plastic and not plastic, I'm calling it plastic, sticky tape. They'll just leave the sticky tape behind. It doesn't bother them in the least, so I don't bother to remove the sticky tape before I throw the cardboard boxes in, because it's quite easy to pull out. I mean, sometimes I do, sometimes I don't, but it's not something to worry about. So this is the big bin, and it's looking very good. It just needs to be fed, because there's so many worms in here. I've got a 35-40 litre containers, and once I pick them up from the homes that gives me the scraps, I throw that in. It's gone in a few days. So yeah, it's looking very good, and no problems with it other than desperately needing to be fed. And of course, it's always an issue with seeds popping up in vermicompost bins, because we don't want the temperatures to get hot enough to cook the seeds, because then we'll be cooking the worms as well. So that's these two bins emptied. We've said goodbye to them now. We're left with two other bins, which is the cardboard only bin, which we'll have a look at that next week, and we'll say goodbye to the mother bin. And in case you're worried, there will be another series coming along quite soon on worm bins, but this will be the stackable worm bin. So we look at some of the trials, tribulations and issues regarding them. As always, thanks ever so much for watching, and I'll see you all next week for the final episode.